Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multidimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 284 of Game Master's Journey. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. On this show, we discuss the craft and the art of game mastering. I've been running RPGs for over 29 years now, and I produce this show in the hopes that you can benefit from my experience, my triumphs, and my mistakes. So welcome back to the show, everyone. I hope everyone is enjoying the end of the summer and maybe beginning of fall, depending where in the world you are, as much as can be enjoyed anyway with everything that's going on right now. But, we're making the most of it. And, since we have to spend so much time inside and getting together with our friends online, it's a great time to get some good gaming in. So this is a really exciting episode for me. This is the first episode of the 15th season of this show. And it's also our first subscriber only episode. So if you're listening to this episode right now, that means that you've stepped up and become a patron of the show. And yeah, so it just occurred to me this morning as I was getting ready to record this episode that one of the benefits of this that I'm not even sure I had thought about before or even mentioned before is you're not going to have to listen to me go on and on about the Patreon, because if you're listening to this, you're already a patron. So I don't need to tell you about it. So that's awesome. I do just want to say really quickly, though, just in case any of you have had any problems getting the episode or anything like that as a patron, you do get access to your own RSS feed through the Patreon page. So if you had to manually download this episode, you should be able, when you go to my Patreon page and you log in, you should, I believe it's on the right-hand kind of margin of the page. There should be a little box that tells you about the private RSS feed, and you just want to use that feed to subscribe to this show in whatever app you use, and then you will get access to the new episodes that way. So hopefully everyone can do that. If you have any problems with that, let me know. I can help you out. You can shoot me an email at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com, or just hit me up in our Discord server. Which reminds me, we have a Discord server. We've had one for quite some time, but as part of this new segment of the life of the show, now that it's a subscription-only show, I made a special channel in our Discord server just for the patrons. And I can tell you that is where 90% of the discussions on the Discord server are happening. So if you go to the Discord server and you look in the public channel and it seems like not much is going on, all the action is in the patron channel now. So if you are a patron of the show, you get access to that channel. And if you look at the pinned message in the Discord, there's a link to an article that explains how to get that set up if you're having any problems at all getting access to that Discord channel. So when you sign up on Patreon, it should happen fairly automatically, but I know some people have had troubles. So I posted the link to that article for you, and it walks you through how to make sure that you have the access you should have on the Discord server. So definitely come over there and hang out and say hi. And that's a great place if you have any questions or suggestions for topics for the show or anything like that. That's a great place to do that, is on the Discord server in the patron channel. So one of the things that I'm really excited about with this new subscription show is that I think I will be able to much better tailor the episodes to what you all want to hear about. And so today we are going to talk about world building, and we're talking about world building because that's what you, the patrons, wanted me to talk about. So I got some questions from the patrons, and I got some topic ideas from the patrons, from you all, for this episode. And as I was writing the episode, it quickly became a lot. So it's actually going to be a two-parter. We're going to do 2 episodes on world building, and we have hit our goal for 1 episode per month on the Patreon. However, we have had so many new patrons in the last month or so since I announced this, and so many of you have stepped up, and quite a few of you are contributing more than $2 a month, which is the level I'm asking you to contribute at to receive the new episodes. And so just as a token of my appreciation for all of you that have stepped up to support the show, I decided that even though we haven't hit our goal for 2 episodes a month yet, I'm going to do 2 episodes this month for September, and they're going to be these 2 world building episodes. So I'm not sure how far we'll get through this today in this first episode, but some of the topics I'm going to cover over this 2 episode series are using cliches in your game, when and how to do that, small scale world building and stories. So how to world build in a small scale, and how to get your players interested in small scale stories, which is to say, not stories about saving the world, but more intimate or immediate or local scale stories. Also, we're going to talk about how to create a world that the players are invested and interested in, and how to increase player interest in your world, if that can be done. We're also going to talk about using player ideas and backstories in your adventures, and some ideas of how you can do that. And then we're going to talk about reflecting different cultures in your world. So how you can take inspiration from various real world cultures that exist and have existed to bring more diversity and more variety into your world, and to make it more interesting. And as part of that, I am going to give you a reading list of anthropological books that are approachable by the lay person, by someone who's not an anthropologist, namely ethnographies, which are books that are an in-depth study of a specific culture. And just the way that most ethnographies, or at least many ethnographies, are written, they're often written in kind of a story format, kind of telling the story of the anthropologist's experience living with these people and learning about their way of life. So they're much more entertaining to read than reading a textbook. They're not so dry. They're more of a storytelling format. And not only do you learn a lot about these different cultures, but a lot of times they're just good stories and just good reads. So I've put together a list of some of those to get you started, because I often have people ask questions like, how do I bring different cultures into my world? How do I go beyond just the European and American cultures that I'm used to, and do something more exotic or more different from the quote norm that I'm used to? And often the best answer I can give to that is to read some anthropological stuff and learn about real cultures that are very different from our own. And if you've never studied anything like that before, you're in for a treat. You probably, if you've never studied anything like that, you probably think that everybody lives like we do, and everybody thinks like we do, and has the same family units and things like that. And that's very much not the case. There's a lot of diversity and variety out there, and that kind of stuff is great to open your mind to new ideas that you can use in your world building. So yeah, that'll be kind of a bonus. That'll definitely be in the second episode in this series when I give you that reading list. And I will put those books in the show notes, as well as links to them on Amazon, assuming I can find them all on Amazon so that you can check them out. All right, so yeah, that's what we're going to be covering for the 2 episodes for September. They're both going to be world building episodes, and we're going to go through those topics I just highlighted. Starting to think about October, and one idea I have for an episode for October is I thought I might talk a bit about a different role playing game I've been playing recently that isn't Dungeons and Dragons, which is the Star Trek Adventures role-playing game. And whether or not you're a fan of Star Trek, that game does some interesting things. And there are some things I really like about it. I've just started running it a little bit. So I thought it would be really fun to talk about that and just highlight some of the things that I see this game doing that I think are cool and are maybe a different take on things. And as is usually the case with things I discuss on this show, these are ideas that you could easily apply to D&D or whatever game you're running or wanting to run. Speaking of which, you may have noticed in the intro today that, again, I'm saying Game Master's Journey instead of Dungeon Master's Journey. So this was something I discussed with the patrons when I started thinking about talking about the Star Trek game. I thought maybe, I should go back to Game Master's Journey so it's less confusing to people if or when I talk about other games. And if you remember when I talked about changing the show to Dungeon Master's Journey, a big part of the reasoning behind that was that in recent years, I've been talking mainly about D&D, and I thought it might make it easier for new listeners to find the show, especially if they're looking specifically for D&D content. However, looking at the metrics I have, I never really saw any change in downloads or anything like that when I changed the name. I didn't see any change in traffic on my website or anything. So as far as what I can see, it didn't have any impact at all, changing the name. So I thought I might as well just change it back since I am considering talking about this other game. And honestly, now that this is a subscription-only show, attracting new listeners is much less a concern for me than it has been in the past. And I'm more concerned with the listeners I already have who are supporting the show and giving you all what you want. And when I asked the patrons in the Discord channel and also on our Patreon page what they thought about changing the name back to Game Master's Journey, everybody I heard from was in favor of it. And kind of the gist of the responses was, that you all want me to talk about what I want to talk about and talk about the games I'm excited to talk about. And you're very much okay with that going beyond D&D. And so that's awesome to know. So yeah, in the future, we'll just talk about anything RPG and game mastering related. So before we move on to the world building discussion, I just want to give a shout out to some patrons. So when you become a patron at a certain level, you get a shout out on the show. And some of these patrons I know have been with me for a while and probably already got a shout out some time ago. But I've gotten so many new patrons that I didn't want to mess with trying to figure out who was new and who'd gotten a shout out before. And honestly, if you get more than one shout out, it's no skin off my back. That's fine with me. So I just decided to give a shout out to every patron at that level at this point. And, just as a rule, unless someone tells me otherwise, I only do first names with the shout outs because I know some people are concerned about security and things like that and don't want their full name read out loud on a podcast or don't want their full name on a website or things like that. So when it comes to my list of awesome on the website, which is when you're a supporter at a certain level, you get your name on that list. And when it comes to the shout outs I do on the show, I limit it to a first name. I don't give last names. So if you want to hear your last name, just let me know and I can do that. Also, some people I don't actually have a name for. I go by how you sign up on the Patreon. So some people just have a username on Patreon. They don't have an actual name. So I just use that when that's the case. So without further ado, huge thank you and shout out to my esteemed patrons, Russell, Eyes of a Bard, Michael, the Shire, damn it. I just have to say it that way. A Quiet Guy, Alexi, Charles, Cody, Craig, David B, David H, Eric, Matthew, RJ, and Richard. Thank you to all of you for supporting the show. And thank you to all the patrons for supporting the show. I really, really appreciate it. And that's how we do this show every month. So yeah, just to remind you, We have hit the goal for 1 episode per month. We're a little over halfway to the goal for 2 episodes per month. I believe last time I checked, it was at 52% of the way there, which means we're probably around a quarter of the way to the 4 episode per month goal. So yeah, I'd really like to do the show 4 times a month, basically every week. So that's where I want to get. But I'm willing to give this a couple months to just give people time to get caught up and come on board. I'm still getting new listeners every day. And a lot of those new listeners go back to the beginning and start at the beginning. So it takes a while to get through 284 episodes. So we'll give it a little time for people to catch up and get on board. But just to warn you, if we don't get past, if we don't get to the 4 episode per month goal, at some point I will probably just retire the show because I don't want to just do 1 or 2 episodes a month for forever. But we'll do it for a little while just to give time for the word to get out. So if you do know anyone that enjoys the show and hasn't subscribed yet, or maybe they're back in the archive episodes and they haven't gotten caught up yet, please let them know, that if they just subscribe for $2 a month, they'll get the new episodes and they'll keep the show going. Really appreciate it. And thanks again to all of you for supporting the show. So without further ado, we're going to move on to the main segment, talk about world building. I'm going to take a drink because I'm breathing smoke right now and it is really drying out my throat. So we'll see how far I can get today before I have to stop. But yeah, let's move on to our main segment. So today we are returning to world building discussions, one of probably my favorite topic, honestly, when it comes to game mastering and RPGs in general. I really enjoy world building, especially if we're talking D&D. That is hands down what I like most about the game is the world building. But even, I've started running Star Trek recently, and even that, there's a little world building involved there. Not as much because a lot of it is defined for you, but you can always come up with a new planet or alien or whatever that's never been seen before. So there's still opportunities for world building even there. Or if you're playing a Star Wars game, same kind of thing. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's already been done, but you can also do your own thing, create your own world because, galaxies tend to be pretty big. So our first question today comes from Lucid Guppy on Discord, who was asking about small scale world building. So Lucid Guppy says, how do I create a world that players feel invested in? When I created my world Neteron, that's a cool name, I like it. I don't know anything about Neteron, but just from the name, it's making me think of like Blade Runner or Shadowrun kind of thing. I guess I'm thinking Netrunner when I see Neteron. It may have nothing to do with that. I have no idea. Anyway, so Lucy Guppy says, I had just read Arbiter of Worlds by Alex Macris, which was essentially Pro Sandbox. I actually meant to look up that book and I forgot. I'm not familiar with that book. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. While I think the world is a good base, my world feels more ripe for large-scale conflict rather than small character-focused conflicts. How do I do world building in the small? Work with characters to make a local area where plot hooks are more available and connected to the players. Should I ask each player for a character arc and then build that into the region? So far, everyone has had pretty generic goals rather than a more focused goal. All right, so as I tend to do, I'm going to go off on a tangent here for a minute, and I want to talk a little bit about cliches, which is a pretty big topic, especially if we're talking about fantasy RPG, especially if we're talking about D&D. We got to talk about the elephant in the room, which is cliches, but even in sci-fi RPGs, there are a lot of cliches out there. So let's talk a little bit about using and not using cliches and things like that. So my first thought when I first read Lucid Guppy's question here, he said, or she, I guess I don't know, they said, My world feels more ripe for large-scale conflict, but then Lucid Guppy is asking about small-scale conflict. So my first thought is, if you feel your world is ripe for large-scale conflict, why not lean into that? Why not do that? Why, if you feel like you've created this world where there's this large-scale conflict or conflicts just begging to be explored or dealt with, why are you wanting to do a small scale thing? Why don't you want to do the large scale thing that seems cool to you and just begging to be done? I don't know. But that's something to think about. Maybe you're overlooking a real opportunity there to do something cool. Maybe you've got this idea in your head that large scale conflicts are bad or small scale conflicts are better. But, if your setting just has this conflict baked into it that you're really interested in, I'd follow your passion and I'd do what seems interesting, even if someone or something is telling you that you shouldn't for some reason. So I know that large scale save the world conflicts are way overdone in RPGs, especially fantasy RPGs, but sci-fi ones too, especially in D&D, to the point of being cliche. So maybe that's why you're wanting to avoid it. You're thinking these large scale conflicts, they're super cliche, and I don't want my campaign to be based on a huge cliche. However, one thing that's become very clear to me in recent years is that if you removed all the cliches from D&D, I don't think there'd be anything left. Not much anyway. Almost every adventure, published adventure for D&D is, if not based entirely on a cliche, is loaded with cliches. The game itself is based on cliches and loaded with cliches. So I don't know if Lucid Guppy is playing D&D or another game, but if it is D&D, trying to avoid cliches entirely would probably be impossible, or at the very least very challenging, and maybe even counterproductive. Because I would put the idea out there that maybe if you don't want to deal with cliches, maybe D&D isn't the game for you, because it's the game of cliches, especially as it's presented by wizards these days. So, there might be better options for you out there if you want to avoid cliches. Now, yes, I can and will and just did criticize wizards for overusing cliches, which I think they do. They have a whole team of writers and or designers, and they're charging premium price for their products, for their adventures. So personally, I think they owe us more than constantly rehashing tired old cliches and just recycling old adventures and things like that. They owe us more than that, because they're supposedly professionals who get paid to do what they do, and their products aren't cheap by any stretch. So you should get what you pay for, kind of thing. However, for you, the GM at home, creating your own adventures for your own game, I don't think it's as onerous of an offense. I don't think it's as bad of a thing to use an old idea or to use a cliche, especially if you're running D&D, for better or worse. A lot of people come to the table expecting tired cliches if they're coming to play D&D. I mean, that's kind of what the game is. So in a sense, at least, that's probably what your players want. That's what they're signing up for. So what I'm saying here is, yes, you should always shoot for interesting and original ideas as much as you possibly can, because that's always going to be more enjoyable for everyone. Yes, you should avoid using cliches as much as you can. However, sometimes a cliche or a trope that's quickly on its way to becoming a cliche is just the thing. Keep in mind here that in genre fiction, which is to say fantasy or science fiction or horror fiction, we talk about tropes, we talk about cliches, and really the big difference, or the only difference between a trope, which is usually seen as a good thing because it roots us in the genre that we're in. So the only difference between a trope, which is seen as good, and a cliche, which is seen as bad, is just overuse. A cliche is just a trope that has been overused to such a degree that people are sick of it and they roll their eyes as soon as it shows its face. They don't want to see that trope anymore because they're sick of it. So, for example, a quote chosen one saving the world or an evil mastermind trying to take over the world. Those are cliches. Those are tropes of various genres that have been used and overused and also poorly used so often that they become cliches. And that's another aspect too, is how well is it done? You could do something very well that might be a cliche in less skilled hands, but you can pull it off really well, where someone who's not so skilled could take a less common trope and make it seem like a cliche because they're really ham-fisted about it. So even if we're talking about publishing a story that you're going to sell to people and people are going to pay money for, in which case there's a much higher bar to live up to than there is for just your average home game, a cliche can be used if it's done in a new and interesting way. You put some kind of spin on it to make it your own. One of the tricks of genre writing is looking for what are sometimes called strange attractors. So this is the idea of combining two different ideas together that maybe at first don't seem to fit together well or at all, but you creatively find a way to make them work together and you create something new and interesting. Combining something expected with something strange, or combining two strange things together. This is the strange attractor concept, and it works very well in fantasy and science fiction and in role-playing games. So if you are using a cliche, I'd recommend looking for a way to change it up a bit and surprise the players. This can actually work to your advantage because as soon as you invoke or start using a cliche, the players are immediately going to expect certain things because of that cliche. So you can subvert those expectations in fun and interesting ways and surprise the players and give them something they didn't expect. So this will keep the adventure from feeling unoriginal, even though you are using a cliche. So an example of this kind of thing in a fantasy book is Brandon Sanderson's book, Mistborn. So Brandon used the chosen hero saves the world cliche in that book, but he turned it on its head by saying that the hero actually failed at the end in saving the world and became the villain. Kind of like if Frodo had decided not to destroy the ring at the end of The Lord of the Rings. He also changed things up in other ways, including setting the book up as a heist story, which at least at the time you hadn't really seen much in fantasy. So this allowed the story to feel fresh and new and original, even though it was relying on a very overused fantasy trope, which is to say the chosen hero saves the world. Again, the bar for your home game is much lower than that for a professional writer selling books. Your players hopefully aren't expecting your D&D adventure to rival a professionally published fantasy novel. So I would definitely say that cliches are not off limits for GMs. I do think you want to do a bit more work if you're going to use a cliche, though. Don't just use the cliche and call it a day. Change it up a bit, come at it from a different angle or something. Do something so that at least some of the assumptions the players make based on that cliche can turn out to be wrong, so the players can be surprised. All right, so all that said, none of that is what Lucid Guppy was asking about. Lucid Guppy was asking about world building in the small. So here are some thoughts on that. So if we're talking about world building in the small, I want to focus on not a world spanning conflict, but I want to focus on something more local, like a single town or city or village, something like that, and what's going on there and the conflicts happening there. I think that my approach personally would be to start with the player character's base of operations, whatever that is. So if we're talking about a D&D setting, this very well might be an inn where the characters stay and socialize. So my first focus would be on fleshing out this location, whatever the player character's home base is, as much as I can. I'd really focus on the NPCs that are there and their relationships with one another and with the various power structures of the city or the village or whatever it is. Focus on the goals and aspirations of these NPCs. What are they trying to accomplish? So it's a really well-known trick of game masters to use player connections with NPCs to get them to care about the setting. And this works really well. So the players probably won't care much about what happens to a random inn in some city in your world. But once they've built relationships with the NPCs that work at that inn, and they have NPCs that they like that are at the inn, then they'll care more what happens to the inn. If the inn catches on fire, they're going to care because there's characters they care about at the inn that might be hurt or killed by the fire. So the same kind of thing will work with a village, a city, etc. So if you want your players to care about a place, a location, get them to care about the characters that are there. Really, really build up those characters, flesh them out. Your players, maybe specifically create one or more characters that you make just because you think this is the kind of character these particular players will like. This player really likes funny or silly characters, or this player really likes mysterious characters, or this player really likes elf characters, or whatever. Try to make as many characters as you can that are well fleshed out, that you think your players will find interesting or enjoyable or will like in some way. So continuing with our example of an inn for our PC's base of operations, if we think about an inn in a fantasy world, there'd be an owner of the inn, maybe possibly a married couple and their family that own the inn. There will be servers, a cook, and other kitchen staff, maids, stable workers, etc. So the first thing I would do is make a list of all the NPCs that work at and operate the inn, as well as some of the regulars. So think, Cheers or Morn from Deep Space Nine. Come up with a few regular NPCs that they're just people that just visit this inn for meals or drinks or whatever on a regular basis. Or maybe there are some NPCs that are living there, maybe short term or longer term. Maybe, I don't know, maybe there's a traveling bard or minstrel who's been hired to entertain at the inn and is maybe going to stay for a couple months and have a room there. NPCs like that. So then once I had my list of NPCs, I'd flesh out those NPCs as much as I could, trying to make them as interesting as possible while not getting silly or ridiculous with it. While you're doing this, while you're fleshing out these NPCs, try to look for sources of conflict and drama among these NPCs that the player characters can get pulled into. So, a lot of this stuff can be really cliche, right? But if you do it well, it doesn't matter. So maybe one of the stable hands is infatuated with one of the maids, but the maid doesn't want anything to do with him. That's a conflict that could be brewing in this environment. Maybe one of the servers is secretly stealing from the inn. That's something that the player characters could get involved in, especially if, one of your very perceptive player characters, like an elf or a rogue or something, sees the stealing happening. What are they going to do about it? The more you flesh out these NPCs, the more alive the inn or whatever the location is will feel. And the more likely it will be that the players will engage with the inn through those NPCs. I mean, you can't really engage with the location much, right? You can't interact with an inn. You can't interact with a town or whatever. It's really the characters there that you interact with. So that's the key, is NPCs. If your player characters are based out of a small village, you could follow this same approach with the village as a whole. So once you've fleshed out this inn, now think about the entire village. So think about, what are some important NPCs in the village? Like, is there a mayor of the village who's in charge? Come up with those NPCs, maybe some merchants, blacksmith, horse trader, things like that. Just think about what does this village have as far as, focus on amenities that the player characters would be interested in. So what are player characters going to do in this village? Well, they might have treasure they want to sell. They might want to buy supplies for their adventures, things like rations and rope and 10-foot poles and grappling hooks and things like that. They might want to buy weapons and armor. If magic is available in your setting, they might want to buy healing potions. So you could have an apothecary or an herbalist or something. So think about those things and then come up with NPCs to fill those roles, and you'll end up using them eventually, because eventually, those things will happen, that someone will want to buy a weapon, or someone will want to buy a potion, or someone will want to buy a new horse or a cart or whatever. Now, if your game is based in a larger city, you could follow the same approach, but use it to flesh out a district. So flesh out the district that the inn is in. And this is definitely an approach I would recommend if you're using a larger city, like something like Waterdeep or just any good sized city. It's a bit much to try to tackle everything at once. It's a bit much for you as a world builder, and it's a bit much for the players to keep everything straight. So figure out where things are going to be happening. And if the base of operations is an inn, focus on the district that inn is in. So maybe the inn is in the harbor district of your city. So there's a lot of sailors there, and dock hands and people that are involved with trade and with the ships coming in and out, things like that. And you can start fleshing out the businesses nearby, the NPCs that run those businesses, things like that. Again, really focusing on things that you think the players are going to be interested in. So again, a blacksmith, an armor smith, weaponsmith, someone who sells general goods, someone who sells food for the trail, dried fruits and things like that. So just think about, what are your players going to be asking for as far as things that they want in the city or places they want to go, and focus on those places, and most specifically the NPCs in those places first. So I use these kinds of ideas in creating my village of Dianara's Rest in my world of Primordia for my Blood of the Avatars campaign. I started with asking myself what amenities the village would have: blacksmith, inn, stable, etc. Then I populated these places with NPCs and tried to flesh them out as much as I could. I then included other important NPCs in the village, like the Lord and Lady Mayor, the captain of the guard, things like that. Sometimes you can predict which NPCs the players will latch onto, but a lot of times you won't be able to. Sometimes you may make a certain NPC and you just have a feeling, because your players, that they're really going to dig this NPC and you're all going to have a lot of fun with it. But sometimes you won't know. Sometimes you just make a bunch of NPCs and it's a complete surprise to you, the ones that the players really gravitate toward. So because of this, I think it really helps to have as many NPCs as possible and to make them as diverse as possible, kind of, throwing paint at the wall to see what sticks kind of thing. And another thing I'll add here is, when you first make these NPCs, don't go super deep in any of them. Make them kind of shallow. Like, I'm talking a few adjectives for each NPC. So you might have, the innkeeper is a middle-aged female human, hair color, eye color, height. When I do height in like a D&D game, I don't do like a measurement. I don't say this character is 6 foot 1 inches tall. I say the character is short, average height, or tall, because nobody's measuring people in these worlds. And for a descriptive purpose, that's enough to know is someone average height, are they taller than that, or are they shorter than that? Your players can fill in the rest themselves. So don't get bogged down in these details that don't matter. But when you start with these NPCs, again, you want to have as many NPCs as you can. So go kind of shallow. Like I said, sex or gender, species, general age. Again, I didn't say the innkeeper is 43 years old. I said she's middle-aged. General physical description, and then just a few adjectives to describe them. And you're looking for what stands out about this character. Only speaks in a whisper, or has a limp, or has some kind of scar or tattoo that's very noticeable. Maybe has some kind of personality quirk. Maybe they're hard of hearing and they only speak really loud, like they're shouting. Something like that. You just need 2 or 3 things, tops, at this point. Just something that will set this character apart from the other characters so the players can keep them straight. And then once players start gravitating toward certain characters or interacting with certain characters more, then you can flesh those characters out more. But wait for that. Wait until the players show you which characters they're going to be interested in, and then you can develop those a bit more if you want to or need to. So in my case, I did this. I came up with a bunch of NPCs for the village, and the one NPC in Dianar's Rest that the players really seemed to latch onto was my NPC Logan, who was a halfling merchant. And he originally began just as someone for the player characters to buy and sell from. So he was a merchant that would sell clothing as well as just general goods. He was just kind of a general store kind of merchant. And when I was thinking about, what are the players going to need or want in this village, I thought about what we just talked about. Well, they're probably going to have things that they find on their adventures that they're going to want to sell. And they're going to have, just basic things that they want to buy. So let's come up with an NPC that runs like a mercantile exchange. And so that was this halfling merchant. Started out, didn't have much about him at all. Kind of like what we were just talking about. I had a name. I had a general physical description. I had maybe a couple words on personality, and that was it. And I just kind of role played him. But for whatever reason, he was a character that the players just really seemed to like and just always went back to. And he wasn't even the character I developed the most. I put a lot more time and thought into the innkeeper of the inn, into the Lord and Lady Mayor that ran the town, the captain of the guard, things like that. I didn't put so much time and thought into this merchant, and yet it was the merchant that kind of became the star NPC of the village. So again, he wasn't the one I developed the most, and he wasn't the one I personally thought was the most interesting. So if you would have asked me before I started actually running the game, which NPC I thought the players would be most into, he wouldn't have been the one I would have picked. He would have been pretty far down the list. So, sometimes you really can't predict. So that's why I really recommend not going too deep in the beginning. Just have a sketch of these characters to start with. And then once you start to get a handle on which of these characters the players are going to be interacting with a lot, then you can do more with those characters. So once you have these NPCs and you've kind of done this this homework or this preparatory work ahead of time, the next thing is just run the game and let the player's interest and focus guide further development on your part, whether that's NPCs or places or whatever. So when I saw that the players were really digging Logan, I fleshed him out a little bit more. He came up with some things about his history and some relationships he had with other people in the village and things like that. And I tried to think of more ways that I could use him in the story. When Dianar's Rest was attacked by a young dragon, I had the dragon just coincidentally breathe fire on the roof of Logan's shop. All the buildings in this village had thatched roofs, so they burned really well. And so the Logan shop got set on fire by the dragon. And, instantly the players were worried about Logan and about his shop. I think they were more worried about Logan. I don't think they were necessarily concerned about the shop or the goods inside, but they were worried about this NPC Logan that they'd grown to like. One of the players was having a pseudo-romantic kind of interaction with him. So just by having the dragon breathe fire on his shop, it upped the tension and it increased the player engagement and buy-in in that encounter. I could have set fire to some other random building in the inn and it wouldn't have had that effect. It was just because it was Logan's shop and they were worried about Logan getting hurt or killed that it worked so well. And I definitely think if I would not have done that, or if I wouldn't have had this NPC that they cared about, they wouldn't have been invested as much in that scene and they wouldn't have been as concerned about what happened to the village. I mean, they probably still would have fought the dragon and everything because adventurers do what adventurers do, but it just, it gave it some emotional impact that it wouldn't have had if they hadn't have cared about Logan or any of the other NPCs in the town. Now, of course, as with any technique we talk about as game masters, this can be overused. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to overdo it or overuse it. You don't want to do it too much. If you put every NPC that the players care about in jeopardy, they're going to figure out what you're doing pretty quick, and that won't be good for anybody. So as with any technique that I recommend to you, you want to use this in moderation and save it for when it's the most dramatically appropriate and it's going to pack the most punch, and then use it then. All right. So my first piece of advice, other than our whole tangent about not being afraid to use cliches, but just being careful how you use them. My first piece of advice for small scale world building was to focus on a home base for the PCs, the surrounding area for that, and the NPCs there, and flesh out those NPCs. My second piece of advice for this is to focus on small scale problems. So a major factor in the feel of a story, as far as if it's going to feel large scale or small scale in scope, is the nature of the conflicts that the story focuses on. So epic fantasy is known for the use, and I would say overuse, of very large scale ideas like a single hero or group of heroes saving the entire world, fighting some big bad evil thing that threatens the whole world or a large portion of it. So a great way to get a smaller scale feel is to focus on smaller scale, more immediate or more local conflicts. So instead of having your big bad evil guy that threatens the whole world, have a big bad who just threatens this single village that the PCs are in, or the single city that they're in. This is still a very relevant conflict that the players are going to care about. It still has huge potential consequences that will affect the characters, but it's much more immediate in scale, and also won't involve going somewhere else, right? You know, as soon as you have a conflict that spans the whole world, you're basically telling the players that, hey, we're going to be traveling around the world, and you're not going to be staying in this village or this city for long. So that's something, kind of a side note, but that's something to think about, you know, and I think sometimes newer GMs get kind of blindsided by this, because they come up with these large scale ideas, not considering the fact that they're basically committing themselves to running a campaign that's going to span probably numerous cities and countries and maybe even continents in the world, which is a lot more world building to do, right? So if you're taking kind of the approach I take, where you're going to start small and build out, you really want to try to avoid those large world spanning conflicts, because they are going to encourage the player characters to travel around. Whereas if they're based in a village or a city, and you focus on conflicts that just involve that village or city, it does the opposite. It encourages them to stay there. In fact, they have no incentive to go anywhere else, because the adventure is where they're at already. So another nice thing about this approach is not only does it limit the world building you're going to have to do, and kind of keeps things confined to a single area, whether that's a village or a city or whatever, it also leaves you somewhere to go. So it gives you plenty of room to escalate the stakes later on, again and again and again. You can continue to escalate the conflicts as the campaign goes on. So as the characters get more experienced and more powerful, they face bigger challenges. So if you begin a campaign with a world-affecting conflict, like so many campaigns do, especially the ones published by Wizards, then you've already peaked. There's nowhere else to go. Once you save the world, what are you going to do next? Save the multiverse? I mean, you can, but it's, you know, once the player characters save the world, it's going to be really hard to escalate beyond that without getting ridiculous. And even if you have them save the world and then you have them save the multiverse, well, what comes after that? How are you going to escalate after that? You know, and again, as a kind of a side note, you know, I notice with a lot of the stuff Wizards puts out as far as adventures and campaigns, you know, they have these huge world affecting conflicts that they involve you in as a first level character or a fifth level character. And then the entire campaign is about that one conflict. So you start as a first level character, you play to 15th or 17th level or something. But when it's over, the campaign was all about one thing. You defeated one big villain, you know, you told one story in all that time, which, you know, if you're starting at first level and going to 15th level, you're talking years of real world gameplay time that's going to take to get through that if you're playing once a week or whatever. And that's very unsatisfying. And for anyone who's run or played in these campaigns that Wizards puts out, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. You put years into this thing, or at the very least months. And at the end of the day, when it's all over, you look back and you feel like we didn't really accomplish that much. We did this one thing. We told one story. I feel like in 2 years of gaming and 15 plus levels of play, we could have told 10 stories, right? So that's another problem is if you're going to do this world affecting conflict and you're going to start the characters at first level, well, of course, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that first level characters are going to be able to save the world. So you're going to have to draw this thing out forever to give the player characters time to get to high enough level that it makes sense and is satisfying that they save the world. So way better, in my mind, to save that kind of thing for later, for the end of the campaign, and start out with this smaller scale stuff. And then you can continue to escalate each adventure. You can continue to escalate as the player characters face bigger and bigger problems, which is funny because that's what they recommend in the DMG that you do, but yet their own adventures don't do that. So if you start your campaign with a conflict that just involves a single village that the player characters are in, they can get through that adventure, resolve that conflict, and then you can escalate next to a conflict that involves an actual city larger than the village. And then once they resolve that and they complete that adventure, then you can have a conflict that involves the entire nation that these places are in. And then after that, you can have a conflict that involves the whole world if you want. So you're continuing to escalate through the campaign. So as the player characters are gaining levels, they're getting more magic items, they're getting more experienced in adventuring and solving problems, they're facing greater challenges all the time. And not only does that scale with the way D&D works as far as leveling and CR and encounter balancing and all that crap, it also just makes sense narratively, right? Because again, once you save the world, where can you go from that? You've already peaked. Anything else is going to be kind of a letdown after that. So you want to start small first and then go big later. And you could even start smaller than a conflict involving a single village. For instance, you could have conflicts among the NPCs at this inn or whatever you're using and focus on that for the first adventure. I mean, if we're talking a first level adventure, I mean, it should be a pretty small scale thing anyway. So, start with this idea of an employee stealing from the inn and start with that. How do the players react with that? And just dealing with that situation as the first adventure. Or maybe there's another innkeeper in the city that's trying to force the innkeeper of the inn that the players frequent to sell their inn or whatever, trying to put them out of business. That's something that the player characters could get involved in, especially if you've gotten the players to care about this inn and the innkeeper. So there you go, Lucid Guppy and everyone else. I racked my brain on this, and there's some ideas I came up with as far as how I would approach this, focusing on smaller scale world building. And, I really don't know anything more than what I read to you as far as where Lucid Guppy is coming from, what kind of game they're running, what genre, what, if this is like just a single adventure or a long campaign or what, and also where they're at in their world building. But, I could assume that maybe they're starting out and they're doing what I suggest. And I've talked about this in previous world building episodes, but if you're starting out and you're going to start world building, you're going to start building a brand new world, I would start with some big picture stuff, like come up with your gods, if they're going to be gods, the pantheon, maybe get a general idea of maybe how many continents there are, or at least, kind of the layout of the continent the player characters are going to be on, like how many nations are there, cities, things like that, like just some kind of big picture stuff. And you don't need a lot, just some general ideas, because you can fill all that in later. But really where you want to start, once you just come up with some general ideas and big picture stuff, is you really want to drill down to where is the first adventure going to be. And I would recommend focusing either on a small village or a town or perhaps a smaller city, and focus your world building on that. and kind of keep the players there with this small scale stuff and build out from there. As the players explore more and venture out further, you can be behind the scenes kind of building the world kind of in front of them as they go, so to speak. Otherwise, if you try to build the entire world, if you decide you're going to create the Forgotten Realms, you'll be world building for months or years and not playing or running games. So with my method, you world build maybe, a few weeks or something, or a few days, depending how much detail you want, but you're really just focusing on this one small area. And once that area is ready to go, once you got your village fleshed out and maybe, some of the surrounding area, like, oh, there's a forest here and a river there and, hills there or whatever, and mountains off in that direction. Once you have that, you can start running your campaign and you can still world build, in the background between sessions, but you can be playing and your players can be playing instead of waiting months or years. And it gives you lots of room to change your mind or come up with new ideas if you don't define the entire world first. So again, I've gone into much more detail on that in other world building episodes. You can check those out. And again, I'll have a link to the world building episodes in the show notes for this at starwalkerstudios.com for this episode. So you can check that out. And if that's something you want me to go into again, take another swing at it, just kind of how I would approach building a world, I can do that. Another thing I would recommend if you are starting out from scratch, and we just talked about this a few episodes ago, is steal from other stuff. If there's a setting you really like maybe you really like the Forgotten Realms, or maybe you really like the setting of the Wheel of Time or Game of Thrones or whatever, start with that and either say, I'm going to use the world of Game of Thrones and give myself license to change things as it occurs to me to do so, but it's going to start out basically the world of Game of Thrones and then it's going to evolve over time from that. You could take that approach, or you could just take elements from that world that you like and use that to create your own thing, or take elements from numerous different worlds that you like and put them together to create your own thing. That's basically what I did with Primordia. I took ideas, trying to do this off the top of my head, but the main inspirations I pulled from for Primordia were the world of The Witcher 3, the world of the Wheel of Time, the world of Horizon Zero Dawn, the world of The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, I think his name is. Man, I hope I got that right. But The Book of the New Sun, that world. Yeah. So I pulled ideas from those different sources. Also, to some degree, the world of Rifts, very specific things from that. But just took ideas that I liked from all kinds of different places and put them together to hopefully create something that's a little different than any other fantasy world you've seen. So that's a great way to get started, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's a saying, something like good creators create and great creators steal, or something like that. I don't remember the exact saying, but it's very true. Very, very little is created entirely originally in a vacuum, completely all new. Whether you're talking any kind of creative process, whether you're talking about writing music or writing stories or whatever, usually what people do is they start with something that's already been done and they riff off of that, or they use that as a launching point and see where it takes them. And even if you think that you're doing something completely original that's based on only your ideas, it's most likely not, because, we don't necessarily know where all our ideas come from. And a lot of times there are things that we've seen in the past that our brains have stored away and then offer up as our own idea of, hey, you could do this thing. But it's really something you saw in some fantasy book years ago that you don't even consciously remember. That's just the way it works. And there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you do your own thing and put your own spin on it and don't just recreate something someone else did. And again, that really only matters if you're going to try to publish something. If you're doing something for your own game, for your own players, you can do whatever you want. No lawyers will show up and give you a hard time no matter what you do. So yeah, just do do what you like and build the world that you're interested in. Even if you're stealing things from other D&D settings or fantasy books or whatever, like there's nothing wrong with that. That's what everybody does. So yeah, go for it. Well, I think we will put a pin in this discussion here, and I will be returning with more world building discussion in episode 285. Should be out within the week. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for episode 284 of Game Master's Journey. If you'd like to reach me, I would love to hear from you. Probably the best way to do so is to join us in our Discord server. You can find a link to that in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey. You can also shoot me an email at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com, and you can call my voicemail, 951-GMJ-LEX1. That's 951-465-5391. If you have any comments or questions, I'd love to hear from you. And if you have any ideas for world building type things you'd like to hear discussed, let me know, because I am sure in addition to episode 285, we will be doing more world building episodes in the future, because we just never seem to run out of things to talk about when it comes to world building. And it seems like a lot of you are really into it, and I know I am. So yeah, definitely we'll do more of that. So just to remind you, next time in episode 285, we're going to resume this discussion. We're going to talk about using player ideas and backstories in your adventures. And we're going to talk about reflecting different cultures in your world. And I'll give you that list of suggested ethnographies and anthropological readings that you can check out to broaden your horizons and open your mind to things you've never thought of before. And yeah, it'll be great fodder for your world building. So I hope that you have a chance to play an RPG this week. I hope you have a chance to run an RPG, and I hope you can do some world building. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, let's build some worlds.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music, courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.